December 27, 1979. The Tajbeg Palace stood silent on a hill overlooking Kabul. Inside, President Hafizullah Amin paced his office. He checked the phone lines. Dead silence. Why did he feel safe? He believed the Soviet Union was his strongest ally. But the convoy approaching his gates was not there to save him. Events accelerated. In the frame, heavy armored personnel carriers tearing up the manicured gardens. The sound of breaking glass shattered the night. Soviet Spetsnaz troops breached the ground floor. They wore Afghan uniforms, but they shouted orders in Russian. Grenades rolled down the marble hallways, the air filled with the acrid smell of cordite and burning tapestries. At first glance, a local military coup, but in reality, a calculated foreign execution. Amin realized the truth too late. There would be no negotiation, no political exile. The order was total elimination. He retreated to a barroom on the second floor, but the walls offered no protection. The assault team cleared room after room with automatic fire. He did not die in the chaos of battle. He was hunted down. The soldiers wrapped his body in a cheap carpet. They dragged it out to the courtyard like trash. There was no funeral. His death triggered a conflict that would burn for 10 years and bleed a superpower dry. But this was only the beginning. To understand the execution, one must examine the victim. Who was the man in the palace? What specific orders came from the Kremlin? The consequences of that night reshaped the entire Cold War. The answers lay in the files of the KGB. 1973. That was the year the countdown truly began. To understand the brutal execution of the president, we must look at the years prior. Afghanistan in the 70s was a paradox. It was a nation torn between two centuries. Visual evidence confirms the divide. The footage shows university students in miniskirts walking past elders in traditional turbans. Kabul demanded modernity. The villages demanded tradition. The monarchy had balanced these forces for decades. Why did this balance break? It seemed the king had total control, but stability was an illusion. July 17th. The king's own cousin, Mohammed Daoud Khan, made his move. He didn't wait for a crisis. He mobilized the army while the king was overseas. The coup was bloodless. Tanks rolled through the streets, but the cannons remained silent. Daoud seized the radio stations. He abolished the monarchy. He declared Afghanistan a republic. At first glance, a bold step forward. But in reality, a fatal fracture in the social contract. Daoud Khan wasted no time. He pushed for radical change. He signed decrees to modernize the economy. He built factories on the outskirts of cities. He reduced the power of the mullahs and removed religion from state governance. He also tried to play the superpowers against each other. He took Soviet money but refused Soviet control. He reached out to the West, but resistance grew in the shadows. Conservative leaders saw his reforms as an insult to Islam. They preached defiance in the mosques. Inside the barracks, officers grew restless. The elite split into rival factions. But this was only the beginning. April 1978, the tension snapped. Officers aligned with the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan launched their attack. They were communists, and they had Moscow's support. This was no bloodless transfer of power. The camera records, smoke billowing from the presidential palace. The sound of aerial bombardment shakes the capital. Daoud Khan did not flee. He did not beg. He barricaded himself in the palace with his family. He picked up a pistol and returned fire. The battle raged for hours, but the communist forces were ruthless. They breached the walls. Daoud Khan was shot dead amidst the rubble of his own government. Thus ended the First Republic. The presidential palace became a slaughterhouse. The coup did not end with an arrest. It ended with extermination. The president's entire family was lined up against the wall and executed. Men, women, and children. The gunmen ensured there was no possibility of a return to the old order. No heirs remained to claim authority. The People's Democratic Party took the capital. They declared a total break from the past. Their goal was a radical transformation of society, forcing Afghanistan into the modern age overnight. Decrees flooded the streets. Women were told to cast aside their veils. Land was seized from the wealthy and redistributed to the poor. Schools opened in remote districts. and secular laws replaced ancient traditions. But the regime made a critical miscalculation. They challenged the religious leaders. Why did these reforms trigger a bloodbath? The government believed they were bringing progress. But to the rural population, this was an attack on God. At first glance, a nation marching toward the future. But in reality, a society on the verge of collapse. Peasants refused the new land deeds. In the villages, they rebelled against collectivization. Religious scholars stood in the mosques and denounced the secular policies as un-Islamic. The resistance did not stay silent. Armed groups began to form in the mountains. Farmers traded their tools for rifles. Within months, the countryside was burning. Large portions of rural Afghanistan fell out of government control. The new leadership, first under Nur Muhammad Taraki and then Hafizullah Amin, panicked. They issued orders, but their grip on power was slipping. The regime could not stand alone. They became entirely dependent on the Soviet Union. Moscow sent help. Soviet advisors appeared in every government ministry. They walked the corridors of the Afghan military headquarters. The Soviets provided crates of weapons, millions in funding, and tactical training. Visual evidence from the time is clear. Soviet trucks rolling through dusty passes while Afghan soldiers look on with uncertainty. But this was only the beginning. By late 1979, the crisis reached a breaking point. The communist regime was drowning in a growing insurgency. Intelligence reports reached the Kremlin. The United States and Western powers were funneling support to the resistance fighters. The threat was no longer internal. The Soviet leadership froze. They feared a domino effect. If Afghanistan fell to anti-communist forces, it would be a catastrophic blow to Soviet interests in Central Asia. A hostile state on their southern border was unacceptable. The Politburo faced a decision. The risks were high, but the fear of losing influence was stronger. The Soviet Union decided to intervene. The order was signed. December 24, 1979. The silence of the Afghan mountains was broken by the roar of engines. Operation Storm 333 began instantly. Soviet armored columns smashed through the border checkpoints, while heavy transport planes descended onto the runways of Kabul. The footage shows heavy treads grinding the winter roads. Officially, this was an act of fraternal aid. The Kremlin stated they were there to support the communist government against anti-communist insurgents. But the mission had a second, darker layer. Moscow had lost patience with Hafizullah Amin. He was the head of state, but the Soviet leadership viewed him as a liability. He was volatile, uncontrollable. Why did they send elite paratroopers to the capital? It looked like protection, but fear drove the decision. Reports reached the Kremlin that Amin might pivot to the west. There was a genuine panic that he would open a channel to the United States. This risk was unacceptable. The decision was made in secret. They would install a new leader. Babrak Karmal was already chosen. He was living in exile within the Soviet Union, waiting for his moment. He was loyal, pliable, and ready to implement Moscow's will. But first, the old regime had to die. At first glance, the Soviets arrived to secure the city. But in reality, they arrived to execute the president. The target was the Tajbeg Palace. It sat on a high hill, fortified and guarded. Inside, Amin was with his family and his personal security detail. The assault began at night. Special forces moved toward the perimeter. Amin heard the explosions. He checked the communication lines. Silence. The truth became clear. The tanks outside were not there to save him. They were the execution squad. He did not surrender. He ordered his guards to the windows. He had weapons, ammunition, and a desperate will to live. He tried to broadcast a plea for help, but the isolation was total. The sound of shattering glass and grenade blasts is audible. He was trapped in a stone cage. The Soviet force outside was overwhelming. They cut the power. They breached the doors. The resistance was fierce but futile against a superpower's army. The battle for the palace was brutal, short, and absolute. 700 troops. That was the force sent to kill one man. The palace was not just surrounded, it was besieged. Soviet forces tightened the ring and unleashed overwhelming firepower. The sound of heavy engines filled the air. Tanks and armored vehicles smashed through the perimeter, providing cover for the assault teams. Soviet infantry attacked from multiple directions simultaneously. Why did the palace defense collapse so fast? Amin's personal guard consisted of elite soldiers. The sheer volume of Soviet fire broke them. The resistance was desperate, but brief. Inside the building, the situation turned into a slaughter. In the chaos and violence of the assault, Hafizullah Amin was killed. The details of his final moments are blurry. Some accounts state he died in the crossfire as Soviet boots hit the marble floors. Other accounts claim he was captured alive, dragged out, and executed. The exact circumstances remain a mystery. The footage shows smoke rising from the palace, but no clear images of the body. The Soviets maintained strict control over every piece of information. They scrubbed the reports. Different sources provide contradicting details. But one fact is absolute. December 24th, 1979. On this date, inside the walls of Tajbeg Palace, Hafizullah Amin died. It was a direct result of Soviet military action. There was no ceremony. The Soviets did not return the body to the family. They refused a formal burial. At first glance, a military necessity, but in reality, a calculated erasure. The treatment of the remains was a message. The Soviets were determined to eliminate a symbol. They ensured no grave existed for the opposition to rally around. To understand the brutality of this end, one must look at the beginning. Who was this man? Hafizullah Amin was born in 1929 in Kabul. He came from a Pashtun family, but his path was not limited to Afghanistan. He looked west. He traveled to the United States for his education. He didn't just visit, he integrated. He earned a degree from Columbia University in New York. He studied education and mathematics. Photographs from the 1950s show him navigating American society. This exposure influenced his thinking. He saw the structure of Western power. However, he also found a different path. While living in America, he became sympathetic to communist and socialist ideas. The logic of mathematics mixed with the ideology of revolution. When Amin returned to Afghanistan, he was a changed man. He entered the education sector, but his eyes were on power. He joined the People's Democratic Party. He didn't stay at the bottom. He became one of its leading figures. Events accelerated. Then, the communist coup occurred. April 1978. The ascent was vertical. Hafizullah Amin did not just climb the political ladder, he sprinted. First, he took the seat of Deputy Prime Minister, then Prime Minister. By late 1979, he held every lever of control in Kabul. He was the president, he was the supreme leader. The entire nation was now in his grip. Amin had a vision. He wanted to rewrite the code of Afghan society overnight. He signed decrees for rapid modernization. He pushed to expand women's rights in a conservative land. But he didn't stop there. He seized the fields. Agriculture was forcefully collectivized. The state took absolute control of the economy. Then came the most dangerous move. He declared war on tradition. He stripped power from religious authorities. He challenged Islamic institutions directly. Why did he push so hard? He believed force could modernize a nation in months. But reality struck back. These policies did not bring progress, they brought fury. The population didn't just disagree, they revolted. In the villages, peasants hid their grain and fought the collectors. In the mosques, religious leaders denounced the government. They called the laws contrary to holy Islamic law. The footage shows smoke rising from remote villages, armed men on ridges looking down at government convoys. The countryside caught fire. It wasn't just protests, it was an armed insurgency. By late 1979, the map of Afghanistan was bleeding. Large swathes of territory were in open rebellion against the communist regime. At first glance, a government enforcing order, but in reality, a regime fighting for its life. Amin responded with brute force. As the head of state, he bore the responsibility for the chaos. The government unleashed a wave of terror. It involved midnight knocks on the door, harsh repression, arrests without trial, torture in dark basements, executions of political rivals and suspected insurgents. Archives do not confirm if Amin signed every specific death warrant, but he was the leader of the machine. He presided over a system of systematic repression, but violence demands a price. The goal was to crush the insurgency. The result was the exact opposite. Every execution created 10 new enemies. Every act of torture fueled a blood feud. Families did not forget. They took up arms. Grievances transformed into bullets. The government's heavy hand crushed the fence-sitters. Populations that might have remained neutral were pushed into the mountains. They joined the resistance. In the frame, crowded prison cells. The sound of shouting in the streets grows louder. Amin had isolated himself completely. It was December 1979. The Soviet tanks were already starting their engines. The government's map was shrinking by the hour. Amin's regime held Kabul. It held a few major cities, but beyond the concrete checkpoints, the power evaporated. The countryside belonged to the insurgents. The mountains belonged to the rebels. The military was not just losing battles, it was dissolving. Soldiers did not merely desert. They took their rifles, stole trucks, and vanished into the hills to join the opposition. The regime stood on the edge of a cliff. Moscow saw the collapse coming. The Soviet Union decided to intervene with direct force. Events accelerated. The assault on Tajbeg Palace was brutal and efficient. Hafizullah Amin was dead before the smoke cleared. Soviet forces wasted no time. They moved quickly to lock down the capital. Tanks rolled through the streets of Kabul. Spetsnaz units secured government buildings. They seized military installations. They took over the communication centers. The occupation was total. Who would run the country now? The Soviets had a replacement ready, Babrak Karmal. He was flown into Kabul under heavy guard. December 25, 1979. Static crackled on the airwaves. Karmal appeared on Afghan radio to address the nation. He announced he was taking control. He did not mourn his predecessor. Instead, he blamed Hafizullah Amin for every mistake. He cited repression. He cited torture. Then came the official lie. Karmal announced that the Soviet tanks were there at the request of the Afghan government. He claimed the Red Army had arrived to help Afghanistan defend itself. He spoke of foreign intervention and internal subversion. At first glance, a request for aid between allies, but in reality, a cover story for an invasion. This characterization was a fabrication. Amin never requested this intervention. The very forces supposedly sent to support him were the ones who killed him. The claim of defense against foreign intervention ignored a hard fact. The Soviets themselves were the foreign interveners. But for Moscow, the truth was secondary to the narrative. The Soviet leadership needed a shield. The international communist movement needed to justify the tanks in the streets. They could not look like imperial conquerors. They had to look like invited guests. Framing the attack as a response to a government plea was the only way to simulate legitimacy. It was a cold political calculation. Karmal attempted to soften the blow. He tried to present himself as a moderate. He distanced himself from Amin's brutality. He promised respect for Islamic values. He vowed to fix the disastrous agricultural policies. He told the peasants that their grievances were heard. He promised to loosen the regime's grip. But words could not change the facts on the ground. The fundamental reality remained rigid. Afghanistan was occupied. 100,000 troops. That was the weight of the Soviet boot on Afghan soil. Heavy tanks rolled through the streets of Kabul. Checkpoints blocked the mountain passes. The map changed overnight. Soviet commanders took the real chairs of power. They dictated the orders. They moved the divisions. The Afghan government remained in the palace, but only on paper. Behind every minister stood a Soviet political advisor. Afghanistan was, in effect, a colony. The population did not stay silent. Bitterness turned into open rage. Babrak Karmal promised reform. He promised peace, but the people saw only foreign uniforms and foreign steel. At first glance, a stabilizing mission, but in reality, a hostile occupation. The insurgency exploded. It had simmered under Amin. Now, it boiled over. Resistance groups formed in the valleys. They called themselves the Mujahideen. The struggle was not uniform. Some fought for strict Islamic law, others fought for the flag. Others simply fought for their tribe. It was a chaotic mix of ideologies. What united them? It seemed impossible to organize such different factions, but they shared a single target: the Soviet Army. The United States watched from the shadows. Washington saw a chance to bleed the Soviet Union dry. The CIA opened its checkbook. A covert pipeline began to flow. Pakistan became the gateway. Trucks loaded with crates crossed the southern and eastern borders at night. They carried supplies to the front lines. But this was only the beginning. It wasn't just rifles anymore. Advanced American technology reached the mountains. The footage shows fighters hoisting Stinger missiles onto their shoulders. The sound of anti-aircraft fire filled the valleys. Soviet helicopters began to fall from the sky. The execution of Hafizullah Amin was the trigger, but the foreign weapons poured gasoline on the fire. Three distinct levels of significance define this event. The execution of Hafizullah Amin was not merely a political assassination. It was a detonator that reshaped history on three separate fronts. First, it signaled the death of Afghan autonomy. Amin had attempted the impossible. He tried to lead a communist government without bowing to the Kremlin. He issued orders. He implemented policies. He ignored the advisors sent from Moscow. But he failed to realize one crucial fact. The Soviets did not want an ally. They wanted a subordinate. Why did the Kremlin destroy their own ideological partner? Logic suggests they should support him, but fear of losing control was stronger than shared ideology. They could not tolerate a leader who acted off script. The solution was brutal and immediate. Amin was liquidated. In his place, they installed Babrak Karmal. The footage shows Karmal arriving, surrounded by foreign guards, reading a prepared script. With this switch, Afghan leadership ceased to exist as an independent entity. It became a direct extension of the Politburo. But this was only the beginning. Second, the execution triggered a massive military avalanche. It marked the start of direct Soviet occupation. The 40th Army crossed the border. It wasn't a short operation. It became a 10-year grinder. The numbers are staggering. Hundreds of thousands of troops rotated through the mountains. The war machine consumed fuel, ammunition, and lives. The conflict claimed over 1 million Afghan civilians. Cities were leveled. Villages were erased. For the Soviet Union, the cost was catastrophic. More than 100,000 soldiers became casualties. Resources that could have built infrastructure were burned in the Hindu Kush. Inside the USSR, silence turned to murmurs. Zinc coffins returned to Soviet cities in secret. The population began to doubt the party line. At first glance, a show of strength. But in reality, a slow-motion economic suicide. Third, the geopolitical temperature dropped instantly. The Cold War shifted gears. The late 1970s had been a time of détente, a period of handshakes, treaties, and relative stability between superpowers. The invasion shattered this illusion. There was no turning back. Washington saw the tanks in Kabul and reacted. The era of negotiation ended. The era of direct confrontation returned. The map of global alliances was redrawn overnight. The United States did not send a ceasefire request. They responded with sanctions, boycotts, and a renewed arms race. Thus ended the era of peace. The decision to kill one man in a palace set the Soviet Union on a path toward its own inevitable collapse. 1979 became the turning point. The American response did not stop at angry letters or diplomatic protests. President Jimmy Carter signed the orders. He initiated a massive rearmament program that shifted the global balance of power. Weapons and funds began to flow to Soviet opponents across the globe. But this was only the prelude. Under his successor, Ronald Reagan, the machinery of war accelerated. The invasion of Afghanistan marked the death of détente. The era of negotiation ended. A renewed, freezing confrontation took its place. The 1980s had arrived. Amin's body was the proof. The Soviet Union had executed the very man they claimed to support. It wasn't just an assassination. It was a broadcast to every satellite state in the Eastern Bloc. Why did Moscow go this far? They needed to secure loyalty. But the result was pure terror. The message was unmistakable. Disobey the Kremlin, and you will be removed. Assert independence, and tanks will roll into your palace. This realization sent a chill through the entire Soviet sphere of influence. Leaders in Poland, East Germany, and Hungary took note. They understood the price of hesitation. Fear became the primary instrument of control. Afghanistan burned. In the weeks following the execution, the country descended into warfare on an unprecedented scale. Soviet columns moved along the highways. The sound of heavy diesel engines filled the valleys. But the occupation was not simple. Resistance erupted from the mountains. The Mujahideen emerged as the primary opposition. They struck convoys and vanished into the rocks. At first glance, a unified army of freedom fighters. But in reality, a fractured web of warlords. There was no single command center. There was no shared uniform. These groups were united only by a common enemy. Internal divisions ran deep. Pashtuns, Tajiks, Hazaras. Some fought for Afghan nationalism. Others fought for hardline Islamic fundamentalism. They argued over territory, religion, and influence. Yet they all aimed their rifles at the Russians. The West watched closely. The United States and its allies viewed the invasion as naked Soviet aggression. Washington saw an opportunity. The CIA and allied intelligence agencies mobilized to support the insurgency. A major military aid program began to take shape. Crates of ammunition and supplies started to cross the border. The war had just begun. Billions of dollars flowed through the pipeline. This aid was not just promises on paper. It was crates of assault rifles, boxes of ammunition, and bags of cash. CIA operatives worked in the shadows. They met with Pakistani intelligence officers in safe houses to coordinate the logistics. Trucks loaded with supplies crossed the border at night, but one specific weapon changed the war: the FIM-92 Stinger missile. Why was this portable system so critical? The Soviets owned the skies, but the Stinger gave a single-foot soldier the power to destroy a gunship. The footage shows. A flash of light leaves the shoulder tube. A white smoke trail pierces the sky. Seconds later, a Soviet helicopter spins out of control and crashes into the mountainside. This technology shifted the balance immediately. Soviet pilots could no longer fly low to support their troops. They were forced to higher altitudes. Their air superiority vanished. It became dangerous to start the engines. At first glance, the Red Army had total military dominance, but in reality, they were fighting a ghost. The war turned into an asymmetrical nightmare. The invaders possessed tanks, jets, and heavy artillery. They had the numbers. But the Afghan resistance held the high ground. They knew every cave, every valley, and every goat path. They had the support of the locals. But this was only the beginning. Neither side could land a knockout blow. The conflict ground on. It became a war of attrition that lasted more than 10 years. The civilians paid the highest price. Soviet strategy relied on brute force. Jets dropped unguided bombs on mud brick villages. Artillery batteries leveled suspected hideouts without warning. If a settlement harbored insurgents, it ceased to exist. Hundreds of thousands died in the rubble. In the frame, lines of people stretching to the horizon. Millions of civilians packed their belongings. They fled the destruction, heading for the borders of Pakistan and Iran. Refugee camps swelled into cities of tents. However, the resistance fighters were not saints. Violence bred violence. They hunted down anyone suspected of collaborating with the Soviet occupation. Teachers, officials, and villagers who supported the government faced brutal retribution. There were no safe zones. The war consumed everything in its path. December 27, 1979. That was the date the first blood spilled. The execution of Hafizullah Amin was not just a regime change. It was a grim forecast. It signaled exactly how the next decade would unfold. The Soviet machine did not plan for negotiation. It planned for total suppression. Tanks rolled through Kabul. Special forces secured the palaces. But the real war wasn't in the capital. It was in the mud and the snow. The footage shows armored columns grinding up the asphalt roads. The strategy was simple: brute force. The Soviet military intended to crush opposition through overwhelming firepower. They believed in heavy artillery and air superiority. They brought enormous suffering to the Afghan civilian population. But the generals quickly realized a hard truth. Invading was easy. Controlling was impossible. Why did the invasion stall? The maps looked promising. But the geography was a trap. Soviet forces held the major cities. They controlled the highways and the communication lines, but 10 meters off the road, their authority vanished. The countryside belonged to the insurgents. The rebels operated from peaks reaching 4,000 meters. They struck convoys with rocket-propelled grenades. Then, they disappeared into caves. Soviet heavy armor was useless on narrow goat paths. The tanks were metal coffins. At first glance, a modern mechanized army. But in reality, a beast trapped in a cage. Moscow demanded results. The response was escalation. The generals requested more boots on the ground, thousands more troops deployed, aerial bombardment intensified. Mi-24. Hind gunships swept over the valleys. Entire villages suspected of harboring fighters were targeted. In the frame, smoke rising from a burning settlement. Soldiers conducted sweep operations through the mountains. They kicked down doors. They searched basements. They burned supplies. But none of these strategies proved decisive. The insurgents adapted to every move. If the Soviets used air power, the rebels scattered. If the Soviets used infantry sweeps, the rebels mined the paths. The enemy was fluid. It got worse. The Soviet military found itself locked in a conflict that grew more expensive by the day. Casualties mounted. Equipment failed. By the mid-1980s, the conclusion was unavoidable. The Soviet Union was fighting a war it could not win. The parallels were stark. The United States had its Vietnam in the jungle. The Soviet Union found its Vietnam in the rocks. A hostile population, difficult terrain, a superpower bleeding out against a guerrilla force. The war became a black hole. It swallowed billions of rubles. Resources needed for factories and economic development burned in the Afghan mountains. But the cost wasn't just financial. It was political. Zinc coffins began arriving in Soviet cities. Society started to wake up. Whispers spread in the kitchens of Moscow. People asked why their sons were dying in a foreign land. The state media tried to hide the truth. They portrayed the war as a necessary intervention. They spoke of supporting a friendly government. They blamed foreign agents. But the graveyard told a different story.